No anesthesia. I need to stay conscious. That's what the bleeding Mafia at Heir told the ER nurse right before she dug a bullet out of his chest near his heart. He shouldn't have survived the night, but he did. And 3 days later, the anonymous white roses started arriving. She thought she was just saving a patient's life. She didn't know she was about to become the biggest weakness of the deadliest crime family on the East Coast. Let us examine the clinical file of Celine Vale. At 3:47 in the morning, she sat paralyzed, watching her primary attachment, Roman Duval, marry another woman on a live broadcast. Rain assaulted the windows, her packed bag sitting like a monument to a broken neurochemical bond. Roman promised freedom, but delivered a sterile wire transfer and a directive to vanish. 6 months of conditioning, obliterated by a strategic alliance forged by a megalomaniac narcissist named Vittorio. Yet psychological trauma often acts as a brutal reset. What emerged from this cognitive dissonance was not a naive caretaker who thought empathy could cure a predator. It was a subject fundamentally altered. You and I are going to unpack this case together, to see how a complete emotional collapse can sometimes be the exact catalyst required for survival. To understand her pathology, we must rewind. The trauma bay at Boston Metro smelled of antiseptic and chronic human error. At 2 in the morning, Celine had endured 9 hours of high-stress triage. Fluorescent lights flickered above her like failing synapses. Her scrubs bore the biological evidence of multiple casualties. She was washing at the industrial sink when the perimeter was violently breached. 2 men in tailored suits forcibly transported a third subject into the room. The injured man's shirt was saturated with arterial blood, his jaw locked into a rigid display of pain tolerance. Movements highly controlled, he navigated his trauma exactly like a veteran of systematic violence, a gunshot wound. One of the escorts demanded service with the flat, disassociated effect of a seasoned sociopath, bypassing all standard operational protocols. Her attending physician assessed the threat profile and retreated. Protocol dictates notifying law enforcement for ballistic injuries, but the injured man's command sliced through the chaos with practiced authority. "No police," he ordered. He locked an unnervingly steady gaze onto Celine, exhibiting an abnormally low baseline heart rate, despite massive hemorrhage. The doctor wavered, recognizing the concealed weapons beneath the escort's jackets. "Here." Celine demonstrated her first significant behavioral deviation. "I will handle it," she stated. Was it adrenal fatigue or the magnetic pull of a dominant personality? The operatives deposited their bleeding cargo and withdrew, issuing a strict 30-minute ultimatum. The heavy doors sealed shut, trapping Celine entirely alone with an apex predator who could very easily expire on her sterile examination table. Institutional conditioning overrode her survival instincts. She removed his garments with trauma shears. The projectile had penetrated below the left collarbone, narrowly missing a major artery. She moved to administer chemical analgesics, but his motor response was instantaneous. His fingers clamped around her wrist with calibrated restraint, applying just enough force to halt her entirely. "No anesthesia," he instructed, his tone chillingly devoid of distress. He required strict consciousness, a hypervigilant trait typical of individuals entrenched in organized hostility. Observing him closely, his profile sharpened. He possessed a severe symmetry that triggers primal unease in civilian populations. "I could hit a nerve," she warned, attempting to reassert her clinical dominance. "You could easily enter a state of systemic shock." "Then work fast," he countered. This refusal to yield control is a classic marker of antisocial personality structures. Celine initiated the procedure. Accepting liability for a fatal outcome, she irrigated the trauma site, maintaining fine motor control while her nervous system surged with adrenaline. The fragment was lodged against the bone, demanding meticulous extraction to prevent tissue necrosis. Through the brutal debridement, the subject exhibited 0 vocalized pain responses. He engaged in rhythmic respiration, clinically disassociating from his physical form. "What is your name?" she inquired. It was a textbook grounding technique, driven by her need to normalize the surgical trauma. "Does it matter?" he deflected. "I am currently operating inside your chest cavity," she noted, using dark humor as a psychological shield against the intense pressure in the room. A micro-expression of amusement breached his stoic facade. "Roman," he offered. She countered with her own designation, prompting an analytical response. "Celine, goddess of the moon," he stated, devoid of romantic inflection. "Your parents were optimistic." My mother had an unhealthy fixation on mythology, she replied, discarding the projectile into a steel basin with a metallic echo. Your parents clearly favored empire builders. His jaw contracted visibly. They favored legacy, he corrected, revealing a deep-seated resentment toward his creators. Celine proceeded with the dermal closure, executing complex sutures in heavy silence. Do you undergo this frequently? She probed. He classified the ballistic trauma as a standard occupational hazard. It was a disturbing normalization of lethal violence. She tied off the final suture and stepped away from the sterile field. Despite significant blood loss, his focus remained predatory. Thank you, he offered. Do not thank me, she instructed. Just avoid expiring in the next 48 hours and complicating my shift. He analyzed her features then, a sustained, penetrating observation. In that suspended moment, a dangerous psychological tether was established. It was the mutual recognition of two isolated organisms operating in high-trauma environments. The operative materialized at the threshold. Signaling their time was up, Roman dismounted the table, movements guarded but autonomous, and redonned the contaminated garment. He halted at the exit. You abstained from interrogating the circumstances, he noted. Would you have provided factual data? She challenged. Negative. Then why squander oxygen? That faint manipulation of his facial muscles returned before he vanished into the void, leaving her alone. The grooming phase commenced exactly 72 hours later. 24 white roses arrived anonymously. Her colleague, Ivy, demonstrated social curiosity, hypothesizing a clandestine romance. Celine deflected, attributing the gesture to a grateful patient, though she knew typical gratitude manifests in mundane tokens, not costly arrangements. Phase 2 escalated the following week with an identical delivery. By week 3, the methodology shifted to a bottle of Chateau Margaux, vintage 2015. It was a calculated display of financial dominance. Inspecting the label, she discovered a single initial etched in meticulous cursive R. You are in perilous territory, Ivy observed. It operates as either extreme devotion or the preliminary stage of a dangerous fixation. Celine knew she should have disposed of the psychological artifact immediately. Let us open this case file together. Subject A is Celine, a trauma physician. She should have reported the illicit gift to administration. That is standard protocol. Instead, she consumed the expensive wine on her fire escape, effectively swallowing the hook. When Roman, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, appeared in the parking garage, later, the dance began. He leaned against a luxury sedan that cost more than she would earn in 5 years. He shed the blood-soaked clothes for dark, unassuming casual wear. But the physical coil of a predator remained. When she accused him of stalking, he framed his intrusion as gratitude for her medical discretion. We often believe we can outsmart dangerous individuals, simply because we recognize the danger, but proximity itself is the poison. Celine rationalized her lack of panic by citing the desensitization of the trauma bay, a psychological defense mechanism known as compartmentalization. Roman responded with a genuine-sounding laugh. Understand this for a sociopath. A warm laugh is merely an adaptive tool to disarm prey, proposed dinner. When she predictably declined due to exhaustion and the glaring red flag of his unexplained gunshot wound, he pivoted immediately to a low-stakes alternative, a local diner. A public space, the illusion of safety and control. Against every survival instinct, she agreed to a single hour. She did not see herself as a target, she felt seen as an individual. The tragic reality of human nature is that our desperate need to feel special can blind us to the most obvious traps. Observe the environmental contrast here. The diner was a dilapidated relic of fluorescent lights and burnt coffee, a place Celine chose to enforce her perceived control. Roman looked entirely incongruous, yet he utilized this discomfort to feign adaptability. He initially refused food, claiming he only desired her company, a calculated stroke to center her as his sole focus. When challenged, he tried the pie, only to grimace. It seems like a charming human moment, doesn't it? But this is precisely how trauma bonding takes root. He offered a manufactured vulnerability, making him appear highly approachable. It reminds us that monsters do not introduce themselves with fangs bared. They arrive disguised as someone who simply wants to listen, slowly dismantling your defenses. During those 2 hours, Roman employed active listening, a technique frequently used in behavioral interrogation. He cataloged her answers, weaponizing her own details to build artificial intimacy. As the diner emptied, Celine felt the familiar tug of self-preservation. She stated she needed to leave. When he asked to see her again, clinical observation dictates she should have severed contact immediately. She was being pulled into the orbit of a violent offender, yet, sitting under those harsh lights, she experienced an intoxicating surge of possibility. She offered a hesitant maybe. The profound lesson here is that physical exhaustion makes us vulnerable. When we are deeply starved for connection, even a brilliantly disguised imitation feels like a lifeline we cannot refuse. 2 days later, the manipulation escalated to grandiosity. A text directed her to a luxury high-rise rooftop at 9 in the evening. You and I must recognize this as a classic tactic of the narcissist, overwhelming the target to disable their logical assessment. The space was staged with catered food and silver under string lights, a breathtaking illegal exertion of power. As they dined, Roman carefully dispensed curated fragments of a tragic backstory. He claimed a childhood desire to be an architect and a strict diet of historical biographies, framing himself as a survivor. This is the careful architecture of deceit. It teaches us a grim truth about human interactions. Massive displays of affection early on are rarely about genuine romance. They establish an insurmountable debt. Celine's behavior exhibits a textbook rescuer complex. She shared the trauma of losing her mother at 16, alongside her psychological need to fix things in the emergency room. Roman saw this opening and struck with precision. He murmured about the impossibility of fixing certain problems, projecting a masterclass in feigned grief. When Celine advised him to stop punishing himself, his response painted a portrait of a burdened, lonely king. He made her believe she alone could see the cracks in his armor. She reached out and took his hand, sealing their psychological contract. If there is a moral to extract from this file, it is this: empathy is a beautiful trait. But when offered to someone incapable of returning it, it becomes the exact weapon they use to dismantle you. From a psychiatric standpoint, this phase perfectly mimics the onset of Stockholm Syndrome. The cognitive dissonance became deafening as evidence of his violent reality mounted. The black vehicles, the hushed voices, the casual integration of a loaded firearm into his daily wardrobe. Celine was a highly educated medical professional. She knew she was sheltering a predator, yet she systematically rationalized the danger by focusing on the domestic illusion he provided. The man eating takeout on her couch did not feel lethal, he felt broken. The human mind possesses a terrifying ability to rewrite reality to avoid pain. We tell ourselves that if we can just love the damaged parts of a person fiercely enough, the dangerous parts will simply cease to exist. It is a fatal miscalculation. 2 months into this dynamic, the psychological trap finally snapped shut. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, Roman executed the ultimate manipulation, presenting his immense power as a prison. He stated simply that he hated his life. He blamed his criminal empire on generational legacy, framing his actions not as the choices of a megalomaniac, but as unavoidable obligations. His emotional flatline was explicitly calculated to draw her closer. When Celine placed her hand over his heart and insisted his happiness mattered to her, she surrendered her agency. Let us study this carefully. The most effective way a predator secures absolute loyalty is not through fear, but through pity. When we mistake a person's refusal to change for an inability to do so, we chain ourselves to their ruin. Let us examine the clinical pathology of their embrace. Celine noted a microscopic tremor in his frame, a physiological leak of suppressed panic. She diagnosed him, quite tragically, as a man starved of human warmth, failing to recognize the deeper void. He offered no safety, only the intoxicating danger of the present. This is how the trauma bond takes root. They lingered in the dark, denying the inevitable intrusion of reality, but daylight always exposes the delusion. Paranoia manifested: physically black sedans idling in her peripheral vision, unblinking men studying her routine. Her colleague Ivy served as the reality anchor during a cafeteria break, warning of the tangible danger trailing them. The lesson here is fundamental. Ignoring the symptoms of a toxic environment does not neutralize the threat. It simply ensures you are the last to see it coming. Notice Celine's immediate cognitive dissonance. She defends him, insisting Roman poses no threat, blind to the systemic violence attached to his orbit. Ivy accurately identifies the external predators hunting them. Celine's resistance to walking away mirrors early Stockholm Syndrome, where separation from the source of danger triggers profound psychological distress. The realization of love is not romantic here. It is a symptom of severe emotional dependency. Ivy prescribes an ultimatum, demanding a choice between incompatible realities. That evening, seeking resolution, Celine enters his newly acquired luxury vehicle, an isolated environment overlooking the harbor. The setting perfectly mirrors their psychological isolation. We must understand that forcing an addict to choose between their vice and their anchor rarely results in the clean break we desire. You and I are going to unpack this moment together, as it is the critical juncture of revelation. Selene breaches his compartmentalized reality, demanding integration. Roman offers a localized solution to a systemic problem, promising to eliminate the Watchers, entirely missing her plea for psychological safety. When forced to articulate his true nature, he relies on the grandiose terminology of the megalomaniacal narcissist. He speaks of territories and successions, framing his criminality as a birthright to minimize his own moral agency. Selene rejects his deflective charm, demanding unfiltered transparency. His resulting emotional withdrawal, described as a face carved from stone, is the classic narcissistic defense mechanism against perceived exposure. We must remember that true intimacy remains impossible, as long as one partner hides behind a carefully constructed myth. Selene acutely identifies his behavioral paralysis, labeling him either a prisoner or a coward. This is a profound psychiatric observation. The narcissist frequently adopts a victim mentality, claiming a desire to escape while actively maintaining the structures of their own captivity. For a fraction of a second, Roman exhibits genuine self-reflection, questioning his corrupted baseline. Selene offers a therapeutic alliance, reaching out. Yet, the intrusion of a single phone call shatters this fragile breakthrough. We observe an instant regression. The vulnerability evaporates, replaced by the rigid, unfeeling persona required by his environment. He discards her at her residence without a secondary glance. This is a stark behavioral warning that ingrained survival mechanisms will always override fleeting moments of emotional insight, leaving their victims entirely abandoned. 72 hours later, Roman experiences an acute decompensation episode. He breaches her sanctuary at midnight, exhibiting hyperactive motor functions, pacing the floor like a confined predator. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? He reports an escalation in his syndicate's violent wars, culminating in a transactional demand for his marriage to a rival faction. Selene, anchored in standard cognitive logic, appeals to his individual agency, reminding him of his autonomy. Roman immediately deploys the martyrdom defense. He neutralizes his own cowardice by framing his compliance as a noble sacrifice to prevent mass casualties. This is how the megalomaniacal mind justifies its capitulation to the system it claims to despise. The painful clinical truth is that an individual who constantly outsources their moral choices to external pressures will inevitably betray you. Roman's pathology deepens as he claims absolute responsibility for his criminal network. This is a textbook delusion of grandeur, an inflated sense of omnipotence, where he views himself as the sole pillar of his empire. Selene pierces through his rationalization, translating his grandiosity into its devastating practical effect. She is not politically valuable, therefore she is disposable. Cornered by her accurate assessment, Roman resorts to desperate future faking. He grips her hands and requests a 14-day extension, promising an apocalyptic escape. It is a fabricated lifeline designed entirely to delay the immediate emotional rupture. Selene, heavily influenced by the trauma bond, observes the structural collapse of her reality, but negotiates with the architect of her destruction. We see that irrational hope is frequently the most dangerous symptom of a toxic attachment. Against all self-preservation instincts, Selene deliberately represses her analytical faculties. She validates his future faking, securing the promise of a disappearance. In this heightened state of distress, Roman finally deploys the ultimate psychological anchor, a declaration of love. By introducing this variable at the exact moment of their fracture, he guarantees her compliance. They isolate themselves in physical connection, ignoring the clinical reality that a 14-day timeline is an eternity in a crisis state. Predictably, the detachment phase begins immediately. Roman initiates a systematic withdrawal. His communication degrades into brief, mechanical interactions. He is actively desensitizing himself to her absence. The profound lesson here is that a delayed abandonment is still an abandonment, merely stretched out to maximize the psychological torment of the surviving victim. Observe the duality of Selene's coping mechanism. Her subconscious recognizes the impending betrayal, prompting her to construct an independent exit strategy involving relocation. Yet her conscious mind remains trapped in the Stockholm dynamic. By day 12, Roman initiates total silence, a classic punitive tactic used by narcissists to finalize the discard phase. The definitive proof arrives through a digital publication confirming the dynastic alliance. The visual evidence presents Roman perfectly integrated into his predatory world. When confronted with this irrefutable data, Celine's psychological defenses harden into absolute denial. She rejects the visual proof, clinging violently to the original, fabricated promise. Rationalizing obvious betrayal is simply the human mind's final, desperate attempt to prevent a total emotional collapse when confronted with an unendurable truth. Let us open the case file on Celine, shall we? You and I are going to examine this psychological descent together. On day 14, the exact day Roman promised they would escape, she waited at an empty safe house 40 minutes outside the city. The rain tapped against the glass like a metronome for her rising panic. Midnight came and went. At 2 a.m, her phone vibrated, a command to turn on the news. There, under the bright lights, stood Roman Duval, marrying Celeste Laurent. This broadcast was the ultimate psychological manipulation of a megalomaniac narcissist. The kingpin Vittorio had orchestrated this union to merge two crime dynasties, leaving Celine completely discarded. We must clinically observe what happened next. Something inside Celine fractured, fundamentally shifting her baseline reality. Her phone vibrated with a message from Roman. He offered her money to disappear. To these predators, affection is simply a transaction, a loose end requiring a wire transfer. But Celine did not break into tears. Her fragile optimism burned away, replaced by a cold, clinical rage. She refused the role of the passive victim. She grabbed her bag and walked out into the severe storm, intent on forcing her abuser to look her in the eye and explain his betrayal. She was heading straight to the Laurent estate, directly into the jaws of the syndicate. She possessed no invitation and no tactical strategy. She reached out to Luca Reiner, a low-level syndicate soldier, who owed her a life debt for treating his brother's gunshot wound. When Luca picked her up 20 minutes later, he asked if she was certain. She replied no, but her compulsion drove her forward. Through the rain-streaked windows, the Laurent estate appeared as a fortified monument to old money arrogance, sprawling across 15 acres of coastline. Luca nervously noted the heavy security. I want you to pay close attention to Luca here. His hesitation is a textbook display of his own internal conflict, caught between his moral debt and his absolute terror. Luca pulled the car near the service entrance and killed the engine. He rubbed his face, looking 10 years older in the dashboard light. He explicitly warned her that walking into a room full of armed sociopaths to confront a newlywed crime boss was active suicidal ideation. We must analyze Luca's pain through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome. He had fallen in love with his captors, terrified of the organization, but his debt forced his hand. He agreed to help. Claiming they would be completely square, they stepped into the freezing rain, soaking her unremarkable clothing. They approached 2 blank-faced guards standing watch at the catering door. Luca lied to the armed guards, claiming a last-minute staffing issue and stating Celine was present for an additional security sweep. One guard stepped uncomfortably close, scrutinizing her face. Now, notice Celine's autonomic response. Her heart rate was undoubtedly spiking, but she weaponized her medical trauma training. Years of suppressing panic during emergency room codes allowed her to project a flat, psychopathic calm. She maintained unbroken eye contact and dropped the name Castellano, Roman's heads of security. It was a massive behavioral gamble, but it manipulated the guard's inherent fear of authority. He backed down, and the heavy door clicked shut behind them. The air inside the catering corridor was thick with the scent of expensive food and extreme cortisol levels. Luca grabbed her arm, estimating they had perhaps 10 minutes before the security roster was audited and the intrusion discovered. The main ballroom was entirely locked down. Luca stared at her with deep apprehension, likely recognizing that her rational cognitive functions had completely shut down. Trauma often does this, overriding our self-preservation instincts with a singular, obsessive focus. Luca suggested an old servants' gallery that overlooked the main floor. They moved through the shadows of the mansion like phantoms, slipping past horrifying displays of immense wealth. The environment itself was a psychological hazard, wealth and power compacted into something dense and highly toxic. Luca bypassed the gallery lock in 30 seconds, leading her to a dusty balcony. He was only 25, a good person trapped in a bad life. He whispered that this was his absolute limit, warning her that these people solved problems with fatal finality. Luca retreated into the shadows, his Stockholm Syndrome pulling him back to the safety of his captors. Celine was left isolated. You and I have probably both made this mistake. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. You can never negotiate with an apex predator using the currency of human empathy. From the balcony, Celine observed the sprawling marble ballroom. Hundreds of people celebrated, masking their predatory nature behind classical music and champagne. In the center stood Roman, wearing a tailored black tuxedo. Beside him was Celeste, wrapped in imported silk. Roman smiled down at his new bride, and the terrifying detail was that his smile appeared completely genuine. He was mirroring her emotions perfectly. This is how the criminal mind compartmentalizes. He had played the devoted lover to Celine, and now he was effortlessly playing the devoted husband to Celeste. The manipulation was seamless, calculated, and deeply haunting to witness from the shadows above. She watched this psychological theater play out for 20 minutes. She watched the man she loved operate the room alongside his father, the kingpin Vittorio, a silver-haired titan, whose approval Roman clearly craved. Then, displaying a sudden shift in behavior, Roman excused himself. He walked toward a set of glass doors and stepped out into the freezing rain on the terrace entirely alone. Without a coat, he isolated himself. Celine bypassed all rational thought. She located a narrow staircase and descended. "Stay with me here, because this is the exact moment the clinical profile shatters." She walked straight out into the violent storm, stepping onto the dark, rocky cliffs. "Stick with me for this final analysis, as it perfectly illustrates the collapse of the narcissistic facade." Celine infiltrates his secure environment, establishing a proximity that demands a reckoning. When she questions the authenticity of their bond, Roman experiences a catastrophic physiological freeze. The terror on his face is not tied to physical peril, but rather the unbearable weight of moral accountability. His carefully segregated realities have violently collided. He immediately attempts to re-establish control by referencing external threats, entirely bypassing her interrogation. Celine cuts through his deflection, demanding a clinical assessment of her own value. When he finally insists their connection was authentic, it reveals the ultimate psychological tragedy. Understanding that an abuser truly felt love for you while they systematically destroyed your life is the hardest lesson to survive. We finally arrive at the inevitable discard phase. Standing in the rain outside his lavish wedding reception, Celine confronted the absolute void of his empathy. She had abandoned her entire life, arriving at a safe house just as instructed, only to watch him marry an elite heiress on live television. Romanesque defense remained sociopathically consistent. He claimed a lack of choice, citing the invisible pressures of his empire. He flinched, not from genuine guilt, but from the narcissistic injury of being challenged. Celine realized that everyone has a choice. He simply preferred his power over her devotion. The bitter lesson encoded in this final encounter is universal. You can sacrifice your own sanity to save a broken person, but you can never force them to choose your love. Let us open this file and examine the pathology. Roman confessed over the storm, detailing how his father, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, dismantled their escape. He unspooled a horrific ultimatum. He would not simply execute Celine. He would methodically torture her and her friend Ivy, destroying her world merely to assert dominance. Roman surrendered. He concealed the threat, letting Celine believe in a phantom future until the day he married someone else. He rationalized that inducing her hatred was a valid preservation tactic. Celine reacted with a fractured, haunting laugh. She diagnosed him instantly. By breaking her psyche to protect her, Roman had mirrored his abuser. The lesson is grim. We often inflict the deepest wounds while trying to act as the shield. Celine clinically dissected his defense mechanisms in the rain. She noted he had executed the exact behavioral script his father would use, sacrificing her to maintain the criminal empire. Roman stared back, trapped in his own cognitive dissonance. When she demanded he abandon the syndicate, he claimed he could not. She challenged whether it was an inability or a refusal. Roman argued the syndicate would hunt them relentlessly, framing his surrender as an act of profound love to prevent her demise. But Celine saw through the rationalization. He possessed the attachment to keep her alive, but lacked the psychological fortitude to fight for her autonomy. True love requires immense bravery. Without the courage to face the consequences, love is merely another form of captivity. You and I must look at Celine's baseline before the trauma. She was a stable individual, until Roman breached her environment in that emergency room. Now she confronted the architect of her psychological unraveling. A man who married another woman a mere 6 hours after promising her freedom. Roman deployed the word sorry repeatedly, a verbal pacifier meant to soothe his own guilt rather than repair her damage. Celine recognized this manipulation. An apology could not neutralize the omnipresent threat of his father's violence. She demanded clinical accountability. She wanted him to confess that his paralysis stemmed from fear, not impossibility. He had chosen the safety of his current environment over the chaotic restructuring required to save them. Avoidance is a destructive mechanism. The accusation permeated the space, shattering Roman's emotional regulation. He attempted denial, but his lack of conviction betrayed his underlying anxiety. Celine pressed the analysis, highlighting his adaptation to the compliant son persona. He followed expectations because compliance demanded less mental exertion than rebellion. Cornered, Roman's composure finally fragmented. He admitted his profound terror. Interestingly, his fear was not anchored in his own mortality, but in the prospect of witnessing Celine endure his father's torture. He confessed he would repeatedly execute the same destructive pattern, prioritizing her biological survival over her psychological stability. He preferred to be the villain in her narrative, rather than the cause of her termination. Roman confessed his core psychological deficit. He lacked the ego strength to release her. At this, Celine experienced a profound internal fracture. Beneath her acute rage lay a devastating grief. The true tragedy was that Roman exhibited zero cognitive dissonance. He genuinely believed his cowardice was an act of pure altruism. Celine coldly diagnosed his delusion, stating he had dismantled her while clinging to a noble self-image. When he attempted physical contact, she forcefully established a boundary. Roman then detailed his obsessive compulsion. He had infiltrated the heavily guarded territory of her wedding reception, risking immediate execution, simply to look her in the eye. He required the punishment of her verbal rejection to regulate his own immense, suffocating guilt. Let us observe how Celine deconstructs his manufactured reality. Roman claimed to be speaking the truth, but she identified it as a fabricated narrative to protect his fragile ego. The clinical reality was binary. Forced to choose between his human attachment and the Empire, he selected the Empire. Roman introduced a hypothetical defense, arguing that under a direct lethal threat he would have chosen her. Celine remained entirely unaffected by this theoretical martyrdom. She defined the baseline of genuine attachment. A true bond dictates that the person holds more value than personal safety or structural power. Roman wept, a physical manifestation of his systemic failure. He had incorrectly hypothesized that trauma would simply cause her to detach and relocate safely. Let you and I examine the exact moment a trauma bond shatters. Celine delivered her diagnosis with devastating clarity. By assuming she was too fragile for his reality, Roman had unilaterally destroyed their partnership. The psychological impact struck him with physical force. He staggered, displaying a textbook panic response. He desperately urged her to flee, projecting his own repressed urge to escape his family's megalomaniac narcissism onto her. Celine recognized the cognitive dissonance. She called out his inability to choose genuine connection over the strategic existence demanded by his father. Then, the physical manifestation of his prison appeared. A security operative stepped onto the terrace, assessing the environment with the cold efficiency of a cartel enforcer. Notice the immediate shift to hypervigilance. The operative identified Celine as a threat, his hand instinctively moving toward concealed violence. Roman intercepted, overriding his passive state with a burst of territorial dominance. He commanded the guard to stand down. A fascinating power dynamic played out in silence. The operative weighed his allegiance to the father's control against the son's temporary defiance. Reluctantly, he complied. Up close, Roman's physiological state was deteriorating. He exhibited profound ego depletion, his psychological reserves entirely drained. He warned her their reality could still devolve into something much darker. In that precise moment, Celine's cognitive distortion finally broke. She looked at him and perceived a complete stranger. The de-idealization phase is crucial for survival. Celine realized the man she loved was merely a shared delusion, a psychological defense against his brutal reality. This was the authentic Roman, a man who chose self-preservation over genuine attachment. He possessed enough affection to inflict damage, but lacked the fortitude to break his conditioning. As she departed, he offered a final verbal manipulation, claiming he loved her. Celine demonstrated remarkable emotional regulation. She quantified his statement as worthless, aligning his words with his lack of action. She walked away, adrenaline beginning to metabolize. You and I must understand that survival demands accepting stark truth over comforting fictions. His supposed sacrifice was merely cowardice dressed in noble clothing. With the illusion dismantled, she no longer had to sustain her cognitive dissonance. Reaching the perimeter, Her physiological defenses dropped, and suppressed grief manifested as heavy weeping. Traumatic environments, however, rarely allow time for emotional processing. A hand grabbed her. It was Luca, operating on the hyper-aroused reflexes of a subject conditioned by constant threat. He recognized the surveillance breach and initiated immediate evasion protocols, forcing her into an untraceable vehicle. His actions were driven by the ingrained paranoia necessary to survive a criminal syndicate. As the tires fought for traction, he quickly assessed her psychological state to verify if the immense risk was justified. Celine confirmed she had obtained her closure, watching the estate fade away. Behind them, the compound glowed like a monument to generational pathology. Roman was regressing to his baseline, returning to a tactical marriage orchestrated by a megalomaniac narcissist. Celine admitted she possessed nothing but hope, a fragile anchor in a world of ruthless pragmatism. Luca, exhibiting the anxiety of a subject trapped in a predatory orbit, pointed out that hope is not an evasion strategy. The heavy rain mirrored her internal desolation. Then, an external stimulus shattered their temporary safety. An unknown number appeared on her screen. The voice possessed the terrifying, modulated calm of an apex predator. Damien Duval announced himself. He did not yell, he simply occupied the space, instantly altering their psychological threat matrix. Luca displayed the acute pallor of a subordinate conditioned by absolute fear. Damien bypassed intimidation for sophisticated psychological warfare. He established omniscience over her movements, dismissing her emotional confrontation as a predictable behavioral anomaly. Then came the boundary setting, delivered with the chilling precision of a sociopath. He outlined the consequences of contacting his son again. It was not a warning, but a guarantee of systematic torture. He designed the threat to maximize anticipatory dread, directly stimulating her amygdala. Celine's autonomic nervous system engaged entirely, forcing immediate verbal submission. Damien dictated a 24-hour deadline to vanish. The call terminated, leaving paralyzing terror inside the vehicle. Luca's panic validated the threat's severity. Celine had to immediately assess her resources. Her established life and networks were neutralized by a single conversation. Driven by a primal survival instinct, she checked her banking records. $50,000 had been deposited. I want you to understand this transaction. It was not generosity. It was a psychological defense mechanism from Roman, a desperate attempt to purchase absolution for his complicity in her destruction. Her ego demanded. She rejected the funds to maintain moral superiority, but true resilience requires intense pragmatism. You cannot afford pride when a predator is actively hunting you. She recognized the absolute necessity of the capital to disappear completely from the syndicate's reach. Her brain scanned for optimal geographical distance, settling on Portland for a complete displacement strategy. Luca validated the tactic, outlining a secure transit protocol using cash to eliminate her digital footprint. Questioned about his own safety, Luca exhibited a fascinating self-assessment heavily colored by Stockholm Syndrome. He categorized himself as a low-value asset, anticipating physical retaliation, but accepting the abuse as a standard operational condition. He then offered crucial psychological counsel. He instructed her to actively sever her emotional attachments to the trauma. Carrying unmanaged grief creates dangerous cognitive blind spots. Maintaining hypervigilance unclouded by the toxic residue of her past relationship would be the only way to ensure survival. Let us evaluate Luca's observation. Genuine empathy is incompatible with the sociopathic metrics of power governing Roman's existence. Celine engaged in a common cognitive distortion. The irrational belief that her attachment could override ingrained generational pathology. There are never exceptions in these structures, only casualties. Luca executed the final extraction, providing untraceable funds before initiating his retreat. His final directive was simply to survive. Standing alone in the transit center, Celine experienced the profound isolation following a traumatic severance. The surrounding decay mirrored her internal landscape. She was stripped of illusion, empty, and braced for complete psychological reconstruction. You and I both know, we cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke us. We now witness the profound aftermath of severe emotional trauma. Celine traded the baseline stability of a normal existence for a chaotic attachment to a man whose capacity for love was eclipsed by his cowardice. Boarding a desolate 4 a.m. bus, she engaged in a ritualistic shedding of her environment, changing her storm-soaked clothes. Analyzing her reflection in a fractured mirror, she documented a permanent cognitive shift. The naive medical professional who harbored the dangerous delusion that love could rehabilitate a monster was effectively deceased. That version of her had been incinerated the moment she watched him marry another. The organism that survived the psychological fire was hardened, irreparably altered, yet fundamentally functional. Surviving a narcissist rarely leaves you whole. Let us open the clinical file on our subject Celine. We observe the classic hypervigilance of a trauma survivor in the acute flight stage. She sat bolted to a plastic station chair, anticipating the violent intrusion of the megalomaniac narcissist she was escaping. Every passing shadow triggered her sympathetic nervous system. At 3:47 in the morning, exactly 24 hours after watching Roman finalize his strategic marital transaction, a bus destined for Portland arrived. She boarded without looking back. Behind her lay Boston, and a 6-month trauma bond she had tragically mistaken for genuine affection. Ahead lay a psychological void. The pathology of her grief was briefly suspended, replaced by an absolute emotional paralysis. The subject was experiencing the profound disassociation that often mimics liberation. As the bus departed, the blurred streetlights offered a hypnotic rhythm. She shed no tears, her psyche too fractured to process the magnitude of her displacement. The iteration of Celine who had been deeply conditioned by her captor was metaphorically deceased. What remained was a raw, unformed ego, driven purely by the biological imperative to survive. It is a harsh truth of human psychology that true healing begins in the darkest isolation. Someday she would objectively analyze this night as her initial departure from systemic victimhood. The vehicle accelerated westward through the steady rain, carrying her toward a destination she could finally claim as her own. You and I must recognize the geographical cure for what it is, a temporary anesthetic. Portland offered a persistent, methodical rainfall, entirely different from the erratic storms of her past. She arrived at 11 at night, 72 hours later. Her nervous system completely drained of adrenaline. The terminal lacked the frantic energy of her previous environment. No familial support structure awaited her, which was precisely the tactical objective. She secured a cash-only motel room on 82nd Avenue, a deliberately untraceable sanctuary. The environment was squalid, smelling of alcohol solvents, with a severely compromised mattress and rusted plumbing. She barricaded the door with a chair, and only then did the psychological dam finally break. The resulting emotional cascade was predictable profound grief, intense anger, and the severe physical depletion of fleeing a highly coercive environment. Crying was an inadequate physiological response to her complex trauma. Instead, she entered a catatonic state against the door until daybreak. Then the cognitive restructuring began. She compartmentalized her trauma to focus on basic physiological needs. She procured a 500-square-foot studio apartment above a local restaurant, utilizing untraceable currency to avoid digital surveillance. The elderly proprietor operated outside standard regulatory frameworks, demanding no background check. The transaction was purely functional, completely devoid of the psychological manipulation Celine was deeply accustomed to navigating. Her immediate nesting behavior was strictly utilitarian: a degraded futon, mismatched chairs, and rudimentary supplies, procured from second-hand markets. It was survival, lacking any emotional investment. The next clinical priority was securing employment that would not trigger a digital footprint. As a highly trained emergency nurse, standard hospital protocols posed a catastrophic risk of discovery by her former associates. Consequently, she targeted a marginalized clinic in East Portland, an environment populated by the chronically displaced and the severely addicted. The compensation was negligible, the labor excruciating. She was interviewed by Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician displaying severe burnout symptoms, who merely verified her capacity for medical intervention. Let us observe how the subject utilizes extreme occupational stress as a coping mechanism. The clinic operated in a state of chronic systemic failure, held together by sheer grim endurance. Celine plunged into 12 to 16-hour shifts, using physical and mental exhaustion as a deliberate blockade against intrusive traumatic memories of her former life. Concurrently, she engaged in radical physical alteration to mask her identity. She severed her hair, darkened its pigment, and utilized non-prescription eyewear. Her caloric deficit was extreme, resulting in rapid weight loss. When she viewed her reflection, the visual dissociation was complete. She had successfully erased the physical markers of the woman who had fallen prey to a megalomaniac narcissist's control. 6 weeks into this newly constructed behavioral baseline, a critical stimulus breached her isolation. She was suturing a severe dermal laceration when her untraceable device vibrated. It was Luca, a direct emissary from her traumatic past. The message demanded immediate contact, instantly reactivating her dormant fight-or-flight response. She exited the facility and initiated the call. Luca answered immediately, his vocal stress markers highly elevated, stating he had been attempting contact for 3 days. He reported that Roman was experiencing severe psychological decompensation. More alarmingly, the subject's former captor was actively and aggressively investigating her current geographical coordinates, threatening the delicate foundation of her psychological survival. You and I can see the classic mechanisms of systemic abuse unspooling here. Celine attempted to maintain her boundary, stating her prolonged absence nullified her involvement. But Luca revealed the core manipulation. Damien, the patriarchal architect of this criminal enterprise, had orchestrated the entire crisis. The threat against Celine was not a defensive reaction, but a premeditated offensive strategy. Damien had intentionally exposed the clandestine relationship to the Laurent faction. He manufactured the crisis to force a highly lucrative marital alliance, utilizing his son's predictable emotional attachments as mere leverage. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for Celine. The narrative of Roman as her tragic protector collapsed into a calculated paternal script. The clinical reality of a narcissistic family system is that offspring are merely extensions of the patriarch's ego. Damien had secured his alliance, viewing Celine's elimination as a surgical victory. In a moment of alcohol-induced grandiosity, he verbally documented his entire psychological manipulation, labeling his own son's attachment as a predictable exploitable defect. A disillusioned subordinate captured this confession and transmitted it to Roman. The resulting behavioral explosion was catastrophic. Confronted with the absolute destruction of his perceived autonomy, Roman's reality shattered. He violently assaulted his father in a public setting, inflicting severe trauma that required immediate hospitalization. And according to Luca, the pathology was only escalating. The behavioral patterns escalate dramatically here. An informant revealed the systemic fallout of Roman's rebellion. The rival syndicate discovered Roman had defied his megalomaniacal father and threatened to dismantle the entire alliance. Roman, exhibiting the erratic impulsivity of a man stripped of his delusions, showed zero regard for the empire. He initiated annulment proceedings, actively incinerating his own power base. He deployed private investigators, desperately hunting for Celine to extract the forgiveness he required for his own psychological regulation. But Celine rigidly held her newly constructed boundaries. She clinically dismissed his motivations. The fact that his father manipulated him did not negate his autonomous choice to prioritize safety over genuine connection. You and I must examine this final critical variable. Celine attempted to sever the communication node entirely, demanding the informant purge her data, but the caller warned Roman's pursuit would not terminate. A new piece of evidence had radically altered the case. It revealed Roman's betrayal was the result of sophisticated psychological conditioning by his father. The apex narcissist had weaponized his son's attachment, manipulating Roman into executing a self-destructive protocol under the guise of protecting Celine. The informant posed a devastating hypothetical if subjected to the same psychological warfare. Would anyone fold? Celine terminated the call. Her pulse spiking, she had to process a terrifying paradigm shift. Unearned empathy is the most dangerous trap of all. You and I must evaluate the core betrayal here. Roman's arranged marriage was an algorithm of control designed by Vittorio, a megalomaniac narcissist viewing humans as disposable assets. Understanding this pathology does not negate the damage. Even manipulated, Roman's psychological architecture folded. His attachment proved conditional. Celine recognized this reality. She severed the connection, purging the contact data of Luca, an operative exhibiting profound Stockholm syndrome. Forever defending his captors and discarded the device, she attempted to re-establish a baseline clinical routine, but severe trauma rarely remains dormant. Weeks later, a manager interrupted an examination. A female subject had arrived from Boston Ivy. The auditory trigger caused immediate vasoconstriction. Celine advanced toward the waiting area, bracing for the inevitable psychological impact. Let us examine the subject Celine, hiding in plain sight. We see this often in trauma cases. The victim embraces poverty as a psychological shield. Ivy, wrapped in expensive leather, sat in the decaying clinic, a stark intrusion of the life Celine fled. Ivy tracked her down through sheer persistence. When they retreated to Celine's apartment, a bleak space held together by duct tape, Ivy was horrified. Why abandon a prestigious hospital for this? But Celine's defense mechanism was firmly in place. She claimed she was building something meaningful. In reality, you and I know she was simply building a cage she could control. The lesson here is simple. The walls we construct to keep our past out usually just lock us inside with our own ghosts. Let us open this case file together, shall we? You and I are going to examine the psychology of an empire in collapse. Ivy approaches Celine not with judgment, but as an interventionist, delivering a calculated shock. The primary stressor, Damon Duval, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, is dead at 58. The official cause is cardiac arrest, but in organized crime, the clinical probability of poison is astronomically higher. Celine experiences immediate physiological shock. Ivy hypothesizes that Roman possesses the latent hostility required to eliminate his father, and now operates without a localized control mechanism. Ivy insists Celine must return to Boston, arguing the threat matrix has dissolved. Ivy documents a behavioral shift in Roman. He is systematically purging the old guard, attempting to restructure the criminal enterprise. Yet his obsession with Celine remains a severe fixation. Celine deploys classic denial mechanisms, claiming apathy, but Ivy correctly identifies the avoidance behavior. If the emotional bond were truly severed, Celine would not have required geographic isolation. What Celine is experiencing mirrors a trauma bond, a variation of Stockholm Syndrome where the subject remains attached to the source of their psychological ruin. Ivy poses a dangerous therapeutic question. What if the subject has rehabilitated, but Celine accurately diagnoses the past? Roman failed the critical moral test, manipulated by a psychopath who weaponized his affection. The persistent rain of Portland serves as a fitting externalization of Celine's internal emotional flattening. She challenges Ivy's underlying motives. The response she receives is devoid of manipulation. Ivy speaks as a primary support figure who witnessed Celine undergo a severe dissociative episode, fleeing in the middle of the night. Ivy observes that Celine is merely surviving, displaying the profound emotional numbing that typically follows acute psychological trauma. Ivy is not advocating for a romantic reconciliation. She is proposing a controlled exposure to the original stressor, to simply observe him and make an informed cognitive choice. Celine violently rejects this. She clinically categorizes Roman as a coward who prioritized the criminal syndicate over their bond. You might recognize this defense mechanism. Celine clings tightly to her hostility because anger is a highly effective shield against the debilitating paralysis of grief. But Ivy introduces a therapeutic wedge. Celine voices her core anxiety. What if the subject remains fundamentally unchanged, merely equipped with superior rationalizations? The solution offered is simple behavioral extinction. She can terminate contact. Celine processes the variables, the audio recording Luca secured. The megalomaniac narcissist moving his human targets like inanimate chess pieces. Roman's catastrophic attempt at rebellion. Celine finally concedes a willingness to evaluate the data. Ivy provides her temporary coordinates at the Heathman Hotel, room 412, establishing a secure perimeter. Ivy notes that Roman is displaying profound symptoms of psychological collapse, consumed by the consequences of his destructive decisions. Left alone, Celine enters an incubation period. For 2 days, she maintains her routine at the medical clinic, utilizing work as a grounding technique while the cognitive dissonance loops in her mind. But the controlled environment fractures on the 3rd day. Her colleague Marcus reports a systemic breach. Neatly dressed operatives are conducting targeted inquiries about her. 3 separate individuals exhibiting predatory persistence. The geographic cure has officially failed. Celine is confronted with a fundamental truth of human behavior. Avoidance is only a temporary strategy. You cannot outrun a pathology that is actively hunting you. Operating under escalating pressure, Celine initiates contact. She establishes a rigid set of boundaries for the exposure therapy. A neutral environment is selected. A high-traffic coffee establishment in Seattle called Zeitgeist. Scheduled for Saturday at noon, she explicitly dictates that any deployment of intimidation tactics will result in permanent behavioral withdrawal. The moment communication terminates, Celine is flooded with anticipatory anxiety. The clinical term is repetition compulsion, the human drive to return to the source of original trauma. Why walk back into a known psychological hazard? The internal consensus is that she requires closure. During the transit north, Celine actively rehearses her defensive posture, calculating the exact verbal strikes she will use. Stick with me here, and watch how the physical form mirrors the mind. Celine assumes a defensive posture in the rear corner of the coffee shop, optimizing her visual command of the entry point. Roman breaches the perimeter at 2 minutes to noon. His physical deterioration is clinically fascinating. The meticulous grooming of a syndicate heir has completely dissolved. He exhibits profound sleep deprivation, hollowed facial features, and the distinct motor function of an individual sustaining prolonged systemic stress. He approaches her table with the extreme caution of a handler approaching a volatile explosive. He takes his seat without engaging in normative social rituals. The ocular distress he projects is so severe that Celine experiences a dangerous surge of empathy. The subject initiates dialogue with a submissive expression of gratitude. Celine immediately deploys dark humor, self-diagnosing as a masochist to maintain emotional distance. They sit suspended in silence. The surrounding environment is violently normal. Unaffected civilians engage in standard social bonding, entirely oblivious to the severe psychological warfare occurring at the corner table. Celine addresses the primary variable, the termination of the megalomaniac narcissist. Roman's physiological response is instantaneous. Muscle tension spikes in the jaw. He issues a direct denial of patricide, though he freely admits to profound homicidal ideation. He harbored the psychological desire to eliminate his father. As for the actual perpetrator, the suspect pool is practically infinite. This is where we see the true architecture of a trauma bond. Roman attempts to clinically deconstruct his methodology. He explains the coercive control exerted by his father. When a documented psychopath threatens violence, the human brain processes it as absolute certainty. Roman calculated that inflicting severe emotional trauma upon Celine was a necessary protocol to ensure her biological survival. He engineered her isolation under the guise of protection, withholding critical data because he accurately predicted she would engage in a lethal confrontation. But Celine correctly identifies the fatal flaw in his psychological framework. Protection without consent is merely another form of control. And here is the lesson. True alliance requires the courage to share the burden of reality. Let us open the file on subject Roman. We are looking at a classic manifestation of a fractured identity. He sat across from his victim, Celine, declaring he had destroyed their bond because he lacked the psychological fortitude to sustain it. Celine, exhibiting the hypervigilance typical of trauma survivors, scanned his micro-expressions. She saw the exhaustion of a man whose defense mechanisms had collapsed. When she interrogated his motives, expecting a reinstatement of their pathological dynamic, he presented a radical break from reality. He claimed he was liquidating his assets and abandoning the criminal empire of his father, Damien Duval. Scene's immediate diagnosis was deception to her. The assertion that a dynastic heir would simply choose a normalized civilian existence was nothing short of clinically insane. Celine challenged his grandiosity, asserting that escaping a syndicate is a behavioral impossibility. Romanesque counter-argument revealed a profound terror of genetic determinism. The alternative was morphing into his father, a true megalomaniac narcissist. I have interviewed dozens of syndicate heirs, and such conviction is a statistical anomaly. Celine, demonstrating the complex ambivalence of Stockholm Syndrome, reminded him of his systemic manipulations, the psychological isolation, the traumatic discard when he married another woman. She articulated the irreversible structural damage to her psyche. Roman did not rationalize. He employed a rare tactic in criminal pathology, radical accountability. He confessed there was no verbal remedy for his actions, only the empirical validation that her desperate escape was entirely justified. Roman posited a fascinating psychological baseline attachment, devoid of courage as clinically null. He admitted a severe deficit in protective instincts during their trauma bond. As he initiated his exit, Celine experienced intense cognitive dissonance. The hostility that had sustained her nervous system fractured, revealing profound grief for a hypothetically normal future. She probed his methodology, searching for the manipulative hook typical of antisocial personalities. Why trust this behavioral modification? His response was a calculated shock. He explicitly denied seeking reconciliation. He clinically assessed his own toxicity, stating she required an uncompromised partner, not a volatile entity seeking retroactive absolution. His cold tone carried the absolute finality of a closed psychiatric file. Today you and I are going to unpack this specific maneuver together. Roman insisted his objective was strictly accountability, a concept alien to the criminal mastermind profile. Celine, her physiological arousal peaking, demanded to know why he initiated surveillance, if not to reassert dominance. He provided a photograph of her charity clinic, proving he diverted syndicate resources solely to verify her safety against his father's predatory reach. He acknowledged her prosocial behavior and declared his intention to permanently withdraw his disruptive presence. It was an exhibition of detached altruism, an absolute anomaly for his pathology. Celine remained immobilized in a trauma-induced freeze response as he exited into the Seattle precipitation, unprepared for a predator voluntarily releasing its captive prey. Let us observe the victim's paradox. Celine had fortified her mental architecture against classical narcissistic abuse, cycles, the gaslighting, the empty promises. She was defenseless against a clean severance. The disrupted schema triggered a localized panic. The aggressor was not reconstructing the trauma bond, he was excising himself. Overridden by emotional dysregulation, Celine pursued him into the cold rain, the weather acting as a sensory shock. When she intercepted him, she vocalized the core contradiction of Stockholm Syndrome. She demanded to know why he was defaulting to passive withdrawal. She articulated a pathological desire. She wanted the exact entity that had dismantled her psyche to aggressively re-engage and fight for possession of her once again. Roman's cognitive processing temporarily stalled. Celine articulated the duality of the traumatized brain, holding profound neurological rage alongside an undeniable attachment dependency. She framed his exile not as altruism, but as avoidance behavior, a retreat from the labor of relational repair. Roman countered, identifying his withdrawal as an extreme exercise in self-denial, executed solely to ensure her stabilization. Honestly, in my clinical experience, this is when the psychological deadlock breaks. Celine relied on her hypervigilance to scan his micro-expressions for deceit, finding only a devastating transparency. She confirmed that unconditional forgiveness was neurologically inaccessible, yet simultaneously admitted an inability to initiate a permanent separation. Celine proposed a fascinating cognitive reframe, initiating a secondary cycle under the guise of unfamiliarity, by labeling themselves as strangers possessing data on each other's pathological failures. She bypassed the neurological triggers of their shared history. Roman exhibited a spontaneous affective response, a genuine smile, signaling a release from his pervasive guilt. Celine confessed the exhaustion of maintaining a hostile posture and initiated physical contact. This gesture cemented their regression into the trauma bond, albeit with a self-aware dynamic. Standing in the precipitation, they clinically evaluated the ruins of their former identities, using a mundane search for quality caffeine to mask the profound psychological reorganization occurring on the pavement. You and I have likely seen patients attempt this exact stabilization phase. They moved through the urban environment, their physical linkage acting as a grounding technique against internal stimuli. Celine entertained the cognitive distortion that they might seamlessly assimilate into the civilian demographic. They secured a controlled environment within a cafe, engaging in necessary caloric intake after days of stress-induced fasting. Their verbal exchange was strictly regulated to superficial data points, intentionally avoiding high-stakes emotional processing to let their nervous systems baseline. The delicate interaction maintained a fragile equilibrium. Until Roman finally breached the superficial quiet, he shifted his sharp analytical focus directly toward her altruistic, occupational pursuits. Roman proposed a massive capital injection into her philanthropic infrastructure, envisioning expansive healthcare networks funded by the illicit wealth of his father's megalomaniacal empire. Celine maintained her analytical skepticism, identifying this as a mechanism for purchasing absolution, a standard transactional tactic in syndicates. Roman negated this hypothesis immediately. He framed the transfer not as an atonement ritual, but as an investment in her demonstrated empathy. He recognized that while we cannot erase the structural damage we inflict on others, true rehabilitation begins when we repurpose our darkest resources to heal the vulnerable. With this financial proposition, he formally transferred the operational locus of control entirely over to her capable hands. Notice how the megalomaniac operates. Roman did not come with an apology. He came with capital. Celine's rational mind desperately wanted to reject his funding, but her clinic was failing. Her burnout was the perfect vulnerability for a predator to exploit. She attempted to establish boundaries, demanding full control and threatening him if he interfered. Roman merely smiled, completely unthreatened. He knew he already had her. When they shook hands, the physical contact lasted entirely too long. That lingering touch was a calculated dose of electricity, designed to trigger her dormant Stockholm Syndrome. She pulled back first, hiding behind the logistics of the deal. The trap was already set. We must remember that true power never has to raise its voice to take command of a broken mind. The negotiation phase is fascinating to observe. Roman offered his personal lawyer, casually dismissing the ethical boundaries of the law. They spent an hour drafting a timeline for Celine. It felt dangerously normal, two adults solving a adult without shadow of violence. This is a classic narcissistic illusion, creating a false safety to lower the victim's guard. Out on the damp evening streets, the clinical distance dissolved. Roman hesitated, asking to see her again purely for pleasure. Every neurological alarm bell in Celine screamed. She knew he had failed every moral test before. Forgiveness is a nice concept, but blind trust is merely a symptom of trauma. Our minds will often disguise our greatest threats as our deepest desires. Let us open this case file together, you and I, and examine the precise moment rationality collapsed. Celine stood on that Seattle platform, bathed in the predatory focus of a man raised by a megalomaniac narcissist. Roman looked at her with the consuming fixation typical of his lineage. Despite every survival instinct screaming for her to flee, a textbook manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome drew her in. She told him to call her next week, then surrendered to an impulsive kiss. It was a brief collision of unresolved grief and undeniable attachment. She verbally denied its meaning, a futile defense mechanism. As her train departed, Roman remained frozen on the platform. His expression, a clinical mixture of despair and toxic hope. The simple lesson here: the human mind can rationalize any danger when starved for affection. Celine rested her forehead against the chilling glass of the train window, entirely consumed by severe cognitive dissonance. She had voluntarily reopened a psychological door to a deeply dangerous environment. Yet, she recalled Marcus and his previous observation, a rather profound truth. I mean, you can run to the ends of the earth, right? But your shadow always follows. She was exhausted from the constant adrenaline spikes of flight mode. She began to rationalize her perilous decision, wondering if the son of a megalomaniac narcissist could actually rewrite his own pathological conditioning. Could Roman genuinely abandon his violent empire? It is a common delusion among those afflicted with Stockholm Syndrome to believe they can save their captors. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic motion of the train lull her into a deeply dangerous fantasy. In her mind, she constructed a narrative where Roman used his tainted resources for societal good, a deviation from his father Vittorio and his destructive legacy. It was a fairy tale, fundamentally at odds with behavioral science. Yet, 3 months prior, she never would have predicted developing a severe trauma bond with a professional criminal. We must recognize a universal truth here. We are all astonishingly poor predictors of our own breaking points. The clinical reality intruded 6 days later at her medical facility. Her colleague Marcus presented a thick envelope from a high-end legal firm, oblivious to the psychological contagion it carried. He joked about her winning the lottery, entirely unaware that this document was the ultimate manipulation tactic. It was a carefully calculated intrusion by a man who understood exactly how to exploit her deepest vulnerabilities. She maintained her professional facade with a patient before retreating to a closet to examine the psychological trap. Inside lay the architecture of a foundation, backed by $2 million in initial funding and a $500,000 annual budget. Complete control was handed directly to her. At the bottom rested a handwritten note from Roman, promising no strings attached. But you and I both know. In the pathology of organized crime, there is no unconditional gift. This was blood money, amassed by a megalomaniac narcissist and weaponized by his son. Celine's mind fractured. One voice recognized the moral compromise, while the other, desperate to validate her Stockholm Syndrome, argued pragmatically. The lesson is hauntingly clear. Absolute morality often crumbles when faced with the power to enact immediate change. She convinced herself that the origin of the currency mattered less than its potential to alleviate suffering. So, she signed the documents, sealing her behavioral contract. That evening, Roman initiated verbal contact. When she expressed her discomfort with him purchasing access to her life, he deployed a masterful psychological pivot. He claimed the foundation was independent of their relationship, removing the transactional pressure. Yet, he immediately followed this by admitting he simply wanted to hear her voice, vividly recalling their intimacy in Seattle. It was a calculated strike at her emotional foundation. She weakly protested that the kiss meant nothing, a hollow denial of her own trauma bond. The human truth we find here is profound. We often build elaborate intellectual fortresses, only to leave the front gate wide open for the ones who hurt us. His honesty functioned as a highly disarming psychological weapon. When Celine inquired about dismantling the syndicate, Roman detailed a chaotic extraction. He had liquidated 3 major holdings and severed ties with 6 crime families. Infuriating Vittorio's old associates, he casually mentioned an attempt on his life, framing a vehicular assault as a mere intimidation tactic. Observe how he uses vulnerability to deepen her Stockholm syndrome. By presenting himself as a wounded man, fighting a megalomaniac narcissist's legacy, he triggers her intrinsic need to heal and protect. He estimated the process would take 6 more months. It is a vital lesson in human behavior. The most effective manipulations are rarely built on outright lies, but rather on carefully curated truths designed to evoke a paralyzing degree of empathy. Let us analyze this critical juncture together. Roman explicitly warned her to stay away, describing the constant risk of violence in his environment. He presented a vivid picture of the exact danger he supposedly wanted to shield her from. Celine perceived this as a test of his character. She believed that because he was no longer lying, he was safe. But this was merely a sophisticated psychological snare. By offering her an escape route, he guaranteed she would refuse it. She acknowledged her lingering anger and lack of trust, yet committed to the connection regardless. Her capitulation demonstrates the most tragic aspect of a trauma bond. The victim willingly steps back into the cage, believing they hold the key. A profound life lesson emerges here. Self-awareness does not equal self-preservation. We can see the fire perfectly, yet still walk right into the flames. For 2 hours they engaged in a carefully sanitized dialogue. They discussed her clinic and his liquidation, avoiding the traumatic triggers of Boston, the safe house, and his violent past. They were engaged in compartmentalization, constructing a fragile new reality, while actively ignoring the corpses buried beneath the floorboards. Her communication escalated from weekly to nearly daily. They established a bizarre equilibrium. He recounted the deadly negotiations of leaving a megalomaniac narcissist empire, while she detailed the triumphs of hiring medical staff. 3 weeks later, he traveled to Portland, requesting a physical meeting. The lesson here is subtle but vital. Humans possess a terrifying capacity to normalize the abnormal. We can weave the most toxic threads into the fabric of our daily lives, simply because we cannot bear the silence of being alone. Her clinical instinct should have been to maintain strict geographical boundaries. Instead, her Stockholm syndrome dictated her actions, and she provided a location. They met on a gray afternoon by the Willamette River. Roman sat alone on a bench, intentionally stripped of his predatory armor. There were no armed guards, no tailored suits, just a man projecting an aura of civilian normalcy. Celine sat down, maintaining a foot of physical distance, an artificial boundary offering no real psychological protection. He noted her shorter hair, a classic manifestation of internal trauma processing. She informed him the foundation had passed its financial audits, but this is the final, agonizing lesson of our case file. You can wash the currency and you can change the wardrobe, but you can never truly sanitize the soul of a man built by a megalomaniac narcissist. Here we witness the love-bombing tactic. Celine mentioned expanding the clinic, and Roman instantly agreed to increase the funding. He framed the wealth as a simple tool, denying it was a trap. Celine searched his face for the manipulation and found only polished sincerity. She demanded his true motives. He fed her exactly what her trauma bond required. He missed her, and he feared he had destroyed their connection. Celine felt a dangerous flutter of hope, warning him that her presence was not absolution. Roman nodded, offering another calculated apology, but Celine was finally exhausted by his hollow words. The psychological lesson is vital. Always pay attention to a person's actions, because words are the easiest weapons for a predator to counterfeit. Celine knew that apologies do not restructure neural pathways. She demanded time to see if he was someone she could trust. Roman agreed without a single second of hesitation. This immediate submission is a brilliant tactic of the megalomaniac, feigning complete surrender to regain the victim's confidence. He acknowledged his past lies, offering to accept whatever minimal contact she allowed, phone calls, rare visits, whatever made her feel secure. Celine desperately wanted to believe his rehabilitation was real. But clinical history shows a behavioral pattern, cultivated over decades, does not vanish overnight. She promised to continually test his boundaries. True change is rarely announced with grand promises. It is built quietly through relentless effort. She warned him that if he reverted to his predatory nature, she would vanish entirely. Roman claimed he was finished with the easy path. In that precise moment, Celine's psychological armor fractured. It was not full forgiveness, but the insidious beginning of it, the hallmark of Stockholm Syndrome, taking root once more. She reached out and grasped his hand. Roman stared at their connected fingers, like a fragile artifact. They sat in profound silence for 20 minutes. When she finally drove away, Roman stood watching her with a calculated expression of agonizing longing. For 2 brief weeks, the illusion of safety held firm, and her clinic flourished. We often mistake the quiet before the hurricane for the end of the storm, completely forgetting that true predators never simply retire. The experiment in controlled distance was shattered by reality. Roman played the respectful ghost, until Marcus delivered a fatal psychological blow. Federal agents were asking about the sudden influx of wealth. The FBI had arrived, polite but surgical, probing the Foundation's origins when Marcus revealed they had specifically named Roman Duval. Celine's physiological system went into shock. Her carefully constructed sanctuary collapsed. Marcus had tried to protect her, but the connection was already documented. The criminal ecosystem Roman commanded had finally infected her sterile environment. Shaking with raw adrenaline, she fled home and dialed his number. No matter how far you run, ignoring the consequences of a toxic bond will always force you to pay the absolute highest price. Let us analyze Roman's reaction when cornered. First, the heavy silence, then the curse of a man losing his authority. His father's criminal empire was under federal siege, and the authorities viewed Roman as the natural heir. If they proved the Foundation was a front, they would seize every asset Celine relied upon. Her rage ignited. He had promised the funds were clean, but the megalomaniac always justifies his risks. The FBI cared only about building a prosecution, and Roman had gift-wrapped Celine as their leverage. To fix the damage, Roman offered the ultimate psychological sacrifice. He declared he would testify against his own syndicate. True character is never revealed when a person is perfectly comfortable. It is exposed solely when their back is pressed firmly against the wall. By offering to testify against the Mafia, Roman was signing his own death warrant. Celine's blood ran cold. This is the apex of the trauma bond, the abductor positioning himself as the noble savior. He claimed it was his only play to protect her. If he fought the charges, they would strip away everything she had built. Celine was trapped in a cognitive loop of despair. She wanted to erase the moment she accepted his tainted money. She accused his world of being a black hole that refuses to let anyone escape. Roman's voice cracked, a rare display of vulnerability, as he begged her to simply trust him. You and I must understand the grave danger here. When a manipulator asks for blind trust while standing on the edge of a cliff, they almost always intend to pull you down with them. Open this case file with me, and let us examine the anatomy of a trauma bond. Celine demands to know why she should trust Roman when his actions are actively destroying her life. His response is the classic manipulation of a megalomaniacal narcissist. Claiming his love is her only shield, she weeps, telling him love is not enough, and ends the call. 3 days of isolation follow. This deliberate psychological conditioning leaves the subject in suspended terror. On the 4th day, an associate tells her to check the television. A news anchor reports a staggering development regarding the Duval crime syndicate. Roman Duval has signed an agreement to testify against his own network in exchange for federal immunity. The broadcast shows him exiting a courthouse surrounded by agents. On screen, Roman projects the image of a resolute martyr. The anchor confirms his testimony will dismantle the syndicate, and crucially, Celine's Foundation is cleared of federal suspicion. Roman has traded his safety for hers, cementing his savior complex. Celine collapses onto her couch. Her phone rings. Luca is on the line, correctly identifying that Roman has signed his own death warrant, as the underworld never forgives. Luca urges her to intervene. Note Celine's cognitive dissonance here. She recognizes that Roman is still making unilateral choices to control her reality, yet she rationalizes his behavior as a noble fight for their future. This teaches us a grim truth. We will readily romanticize our own psychological captivity, so long as the cage is built by someone we deeply desire. Luca points out that this destructive sacrifice is exactly what she asked Roman to do. The realization strikes Celine with physical force. Driven by the classic compulsion of Stockholm Syndrome, she grabs her keys and races to his location. She navigates the expensive anonymity of his downtown Portland high-rise, forcing her way up to the 14th floor. When Roman opens the door, looking completely sleep-deprived, Celine does not run away. Instead, she pulls him into a desperate, terrified kiss. It is a textbook chemical reinforcement of their trauma bond. Pulling back, she confronts him about testifying, pointing out that his unilateral decision could easily get him killed. Roman calmly agrees, weaponizing her previous instruction not to contact her as his flawless psychological alibi. She calls him an idiot, striking his chest. She demands he stop martyring himself and calling it love, pleading for the right to make choices about her own life. Watch his physical response carefully. Roman gently catches her wrist, a subtle assertion of dominance masked as comfort. He validates her feelings before pivoting back to his savior narrative, claiming he could not let his past poison her future. By putting a target on his back, he ensures her foundation survives. He presents his potential murder as a noble gift. Weeping, Celine asks how she could ever live with that guilt. His response is chillingly clinical, stating it is better than her losing everything just for loving him. Under the absolute guise of romantic protection, he has successfully erased his victim's autonomy. His calculated delivery shatters Celine's psychological defenses entirely. She whispers that she hates his choices, and fundamentally hates that she still loves him. Roman pulls her close, absorbing her tears while offering empty apologies. When she demands to know the reality of his situation, he outlines the federal protocols: safe houses, marshals, and up to a year of trials, followed by the complete erasure of his identity. When she asks if he will go into hiding alone, Roman claims he cannot ask her to join him because it would be unfair. Celine sharply corrects him, stating she only asked what his plans were, not for an invitation. Observe how the subject desperately fights for a mere illusion of control within the very psychological trap her captor has so meticulously constructed. Let us analyze this crucial pivot together. Celine forces him to admit his desires, demanding that he actively ask her to stay. He performs a brief display of reluctance before giving her the directive she craves. Clinically speaking, Celine should have recognized the cyclical nature of this manipulation. He is making grand promises, while standing in the wreckage of his own violent choices. Yet, her trauma bond entirely distorts her perception. She convinces herself this time is different, believing they are running toward a shared future rather than fleeing his inevitable consequences. When she quietly agrees to his terms, she permanently seals her fate. This offers a deeply unsettling life lesson. The most dangerous lies are the ones we actively beg our abusers to tell us. Celine attempts to establish boundaries, a tragic effort to reclaim power within a dynamic defined by complete subjugation. She demands they operate as equal partners during the upcoming federal trials. Her final condition is a desperate plea for his survival, demanding he fight for his life instead of accepting death as his penance. Roman readily agrees, parroting her terms back with practiced obedience. He cups her face, swearing to become worthy of her blind faith. When Celine jokes she will kill him herself if he dies, Roman responds with genuine, startling laughter. This rare sound of joy serves as the final psychological anchor, by providing a brief glimpse of lightness in an otherwise suffocating existence. The narcissist ensures his victim will endure absolute horror just to hear it again. The mental cage is now locked forever. Let's open this case file together. You and I are going to examine the exact moment a trauma bond shatters. Previously, Celine and Roman operated on pure adrenal survival, a classic stress response, but that night their behavior shifted. Their physical connection slowed into a deliberate promise. Celine asked about the extraction, and they spent the remaining hours in a profound psychological unburdening. Roman confessed the systemic violence of his father's syndicate, mapping out the architecture of his own guilt. Celine countered with her clinical depression after Boston, detailing her mental reconstruction into someone who no longer needed a savior. They bypassed physical intimacy for raw, diagnostic honesty. Sitting awake until dawn, they dismantled the pathological secrets that usually destroy such attachments from the inside. When agents arrived at 6 a.m., it triggered a clinical separation sequence. Celine watched Roman grab his bag, his body rigid, preparing his nervous system for a lethal threat. At the door, he offered a verbal anchor. "I love you," he said, admitting past declarations lacked true psychological weight. "I love you too," she replied. "Don't die. I'll do my best." The marshals then absorbed him into the protection program. Celine stood in a sudden sensory vacuum, fighting acute hyperventilation as the 6-month isolation loomed. Watching the vehicle depart, she grasped the brutal reality of his recovery. Breaking the deep Stockholm syndrome induced by his father meant risking total annihilation. The lesson is simple: there is never a safe middle ground when severing a deeply pathological tether. Pressing her hand to the glass, she whispered a plea of pure attachment, "Come back to me." Portland had served as the incubator for her cognitive recovery. Now it would test her rebuilt ego. She dialed her primary support, Ivy. "Roman's testifying against his father in 2 months," Celine stated. When Ivy asked about her emotional stability, Celine exhibited remarkable psychological resilience. She acknowledged the fear, but consciously chose action over paralysis. "I need to know how to survive in that environment," she demanded, grabbing at her coat. Ivy analyzed the raw determination in her voice before agreeing, but she offered a crucial clinical warning. "You must understand that a megalomaniac narcissist facing the loss of his empire will abandon all societal norms. The ultimate lesson here is that when dealing with supreme pathology, there are simply no ethical boundaries left. If they identify you as his psychological anchor, they'll use your life as a weapon to force his silence," Ivy warned. "I know," Celine replied, her logic overriding her primal flight response, stepping into the cold rain. She experienced a massive adrenaline spike, a true neurochemical awakening. "I need to learn how to survive a war," she stated. "In my clinical practice, patients either freeze when facing a sociopathic threat, or they hyperadapt." Celine chose adaptation. She was no longer a passive observer of Roman's trauma. Walking through the downpour, her brain began calculating defensive strategies. She had exactly 6 months to undergo a complete personality hardening. 6 months to forge the mental armor required to stare down violent, unregulated predators and never break eye contact. The lesson remains: action is always the best antidote to despair. Patients often cycle through distinct identity phases during trauma recovery. Celine transitioned from caregiver to combatant. The naive woman who formed a maladaptive attachment in Boston was dismantled by betrayal. Now, she was a regulated individual who knew emotional bonds without psychological courage are futile. When the trial commenced, Celine positioned herself in the gallery, her facial expressions tightly controlled to project autonomic stability. Roman was escorted in, exhibiting physical markers of severe chronic stress, drastic weight loss, and hollowed features. Yet, when his gaze locked onto hers, his rigid hypervigilance instantly fractured. She gave him a single, calculated nod. It was a nonverbal transmission of absolute psychological permanence. "I'm here, I won't abandon you. True loyalty always demands visible strength." The prosecution used a forensic approach to deconstruct the megalomaniac empire of Roman's father. From the stand, Roman engaged in the ultimate act of cognitive uncoupling. He verified decades of violence, weaponizing his knowledge to obliterate his father's legacy. The defense subjected him to aggressive psychological battery, trying to trigger a regression by labeling him a coward. "Stick with me, this is where it gets interesting." Roman remained completely detached. His vocal cadence never wavered as he catalogued his own complicity. Celine observed his real-time psychological metamorphosis. He was actively shedding the institutional trauma that equated family loyalty with protecting sociopaths, finally choosing objective truth over pathological comfort. Then, during a brief recess, the opposition's proxy made a highly calculated approach in the courthouse cafeteria. Victor initiated contact using a classic sociopathic technique, feigned politeness masking a threat. His micro-expressions were expertly suppressed behind pleasant neutrality. "I wanted to meet the woman who inspired Roman to destroy his father's empire," Victor stated, trying to shift the locus of blame onto Celine. She gripped her cup but held her boundary. "Roman made his own choices," she corrected. Victor countered with a manipulative reframe, suggesting she was merely a psychological escape hatch for Roman to detonate a legacy he despised. Victor then used a common rationalization tactic, claiming Roman was destroying the legitimate lives of families across 6 states. Celine refused this cognitive distortion. "Those people destroyed lives first," she replied. Victor leaned in, questioning if this was justice or mere revenge. The clinical lesson is stark: a narcissist will always project their own malice onto their victims. Today you and I will unpack this case file together. We observe Victor, a textbook megalomaniac, narcissist, cornering Celine. He describes his daughter's marriage to Roman merely as a strategic alliance. Victor's smile is a dead, autonomic response, entirely devoid of empathy. He warns that Roman is destroying an empire for a woman who may not survive the coming fallout. When Celine questions the threat, he frames it as a simple observation of the syndicate's resources. Celine, exhibiting the profound defiance typical of Stockholm Syndrome, tells him to let the cartel look. But as I have seen in the prison wards, defiance cannot stop kinetic violence. Bravery never alters the cold reality. that a human being can be instantly reduced to nothing more than operational leverage. Notice how the megalomaniac narcissist operates. Victor avoids anger, relying on calculated psychological pressure. He tells Celine to retreat to Portland, framing isolation as salvation. He diagnoses Roman's profile flawlessly. Celine insists Roman would never betray his morals, but Victor's laugh is chilling. He understands Roman's capacity for pathological devotion is his greatest vulnerability. Victor promises she will become the precise instrument used to dismantle Roman completely. He issues a strict deadline expiring at the trial's end. As he walks away, Celine is left paralyzed. The cold coffee in her hands mirrors her autonomic nervous system response, as the pure physical manifestation of profound terror begins to entirely override her cognitive defenses. Withholding threats often signals protective isolation. Celine hides Victor's manipulation from Roman, deeply entangled in her own Stockholm syndrome. She anchors herself in the courtroom, acting as an emotional regulator for Roman during brutal cross-examinations. The initial trial sentences 3 syndicate figures, but as the proceedings drag on, Roman physically deteriorates. His facial muscles hollow out, displaying the severe somatic toll of prolonged stress. 4 months into this cycle, a colleague shatters Celine's denial, revealing a black sedan has been tracking her for 3 consecutive days. Even with federal marshals alerted, the danger is escalating. Celine's absolute refusal to flee, even when facing imminent mortality, perfectly illustrates the irrational self-destructive endurance of a deep trauma bond. Ivy acts as the voice of psychiatric reason, attempting to pierce Celine's cognitive distortion. She identifies Celine's behavior not as romantic devotion, but as suicidal ideation masquerading as loyalty. Yet Celine claims complete ownership of her destructive path. She rationalizes that her past stability felt hollow because it was rooted in avoidance. This is a common self-deception in Stockholm syndrome, reframing captivity as a deliberate choice. As the covert surveillance persists, Celine's daily existence devolves into severe hypervigilance. She alters her transit patterns, sleeps with chemical deterrents, and continuously scans for predators. She performs the exhausting psychological theater of being completely unfazed, while her nervous system remains trapped in a permanent, agonizing state of fight or flight. Stick with me, because this is where the illusion of safety fractures. 6 months later, convictions dismantle the criminal network, and Roman is released. Their reunion in a Seattle park is monitored by marshals from a clinical distance. Roman presence with residual markers of extreme psychological trauma, visibly thin and carrying a crushing unseen weight. His assertion that the ordeal is over is merely an emotional coping mechanism. Celine shatters that denial, disclosing the earlier threats from Victor, the megalomaniac narcissist who promised endless retaliation. She expresses a dangerous apathy toward her own survival, entirely consumed by the trauma bond. Roman, retaining a sliver of rational preservation, reveals the Federal Protection Pact. He understands the danger has merely evolved into something far more insidious. The concept of a clean slate is a necessary fiction for those exiting organized violence. Roman outlines their binary reality. They can accept fabricated identities, severing their pasts, or live openly and risk cartel retaliation. Roman places the agency entirely onto Celine, a stark contrast to her former captors. She clinically evaluates her diverging timelines. One path holds her clinic and professional identity. The other is suffocated by Victor's threat, perpetual hypervigilance, and the reality of being used as a biological lever. Roman expresses a desperate, foundational human desire for neurological calm. He intensely craves the mundane. He wants an existence completely divorced from the blood-soaked legacy of his family name, hoping to finally transition from being perpetual targets back into simple human beings. Erasing your past is a desperate psychological transaction. Celine obliterates her identity, fully embracing Stockholm syndrome by following her former captor into oblivion. The government relocates them to a Colorado town of 8,000, rebranding them as Ryan and Sarah Miller. They are issued fabricated wedding bands and a plausible medical backstory. Roman regresses to manual labor, finding tactile therapy and carpentry to escape the rot of his father's empire. Celine integrates into a local clinic, trading trauma for clinical utility. For 3 brief months, their terrified nervous systems attempt to deregulate. They engage in the ordinary rituals of domestic survival, experiencing a quiet routine utterly devoid of the crushing paranoia that had once defined their entire existence. We must examine how fragile artificially constructed safety truly is. Their simulated perfection shatters when a man enters Celine's clinic. asking for her fabricated alias. Her nervous system immediately triggers a profound physiological freeze response. The messenger presents with the sterile aesthetics of a youth professional, but his micro-expressions betray a complete absence of empathy. Celine identifies the apex predator beneath the harmless facade. He politely delivers the psychological payload. The megalomaniac narcissist, Victor, has bypassed federal security. He demands a financial tribute to maintain their fragile illusion of peace, giving them 7 days to comply. As the operative exits, Celine is left paralyzed. Her hands exhibit gross motor tremors as her brain struggles to process the catastrophic collapse of their safe haven. Let us pause and reflect on a fundamental lesson. Running from your past merely changes the geography of your prison. Victor's reach obliterates their federal evasion. Roman arrives at the clinic projecting a false calm, though his posture reveals severe acute stress. After Celine repeats the threat, Roman steps outside to make a call. When he returns, the psychological toll visibly ages him by a decade. The extortionist demands $2 million to hide their coordinates from the syndicate. Celine labels it extortion, while Roman calls it bare survival. They are trapped in a paralyzing behavioral loop. Pay the ransom, or endure another traumatic relocation until the inevitable violent conclusion. Roman collapses into a chair, broken by the realization that dismantling a criminal empire never truly severs its deeply embedded roots. Let us examine this clinical paralysis together. $2 million is not merely a transaction. In the pathology of the criminal underworld, paying an extortionist establishes a permanent precedent of submission. Celine and Roman sit in the sunlight, yet psychologically they are trapped in a box. Their options pay forever, run forever, or die are classic trauma responses. Going back to the federal marshals offers only an illusion of security. Victor operates on a predatory compulsion that guarantees he will hunt them again. There is a profound human lesson. You cannot simply outrun a pathological threat, because avoidance only feeds the predator. They finally realize that their physical location matters far less than the mental cage they still inhabit. We witness a fascinating cognitive shift in Celine here. For years, her behavior was governed by the flight response. She equated physical distance with psychological safety. But sitting in that clinic, the illusion shatters. She recognizes that the criminal syndicate operates like a systemic infection, testifying bought time, not immunity. Yet, instead of regressing, she exhibits profound post-traumatic growth. When she tells Roman she is tired of running, she is rewiring her brain to reject the victim role. She chooses to pay the fee not as a submission, but as a calculated operating cost. The life lesson is striking. True survival is rarely about finding a safe place to hide. It is about planting your feet in the danger zone and deciding your life is finally worth defending. Notice how agency becomes her coping mechanism. Celine admits the target has been on her back since Boston, acknowledging her initial trauma bonding. Now she claims ownership of that danger. Taking control of a threat is a recognized psychological defense against helplessness. Roman searches her expressions for fear, but finds only resolution. They transfer the $2 million offshore. Fully aware that a sociopath's promise is clinically worthless, they are simply purchasing a delay. 6 months later, the manifestation of her healing is visible. She opens a community clinic, channeling her complex trauma into public service. There is a simple truth we can all learn from this. We cannot always erase the targets on our backs, but we can absolutely choose what we build while standing in the crosshairs. In psychiatric terms, this clinic represents an act of restorative justice. Celine counteracts the predatory nature of the syndicate they escaped by helping the vulnerable. When Roman approaches, we observe the behavioral evolution of a former enforcer. Celine asks about regret, testing his emotional stability. Roman admits to mourning the years lost to his father, a man defined by textbook megalomaniac narcissism. Yet Roman expresses no remorse for breaking those toxic chains to choose Celine. This is a critical milestone in his rehabilitation. He rebuilt his identity to become someone capable of empathetic attachment. The vital lesson here is that our past environments do not mandate our future. You can choose to walk away from a poisonous legacy, even if it costs you everything you thought you knew. Let us open the file on Celine and Roman. Today, you and I will unpack this psychological profile together. Celine knew safety was an illusion, especially when hunted by Vittorio, a classic megalomaniacal narcissist who used surveillance for absolute mental domination. When asked if the terror would conclude, Roman's response was clinically fascinating. He acknowledged the perpetual paranoia and threat of retaliation from criminal networks, yet proposed a radical countermeasure. He suggested constructing a functional life regardless. They selected their rural clinic with full cognitive awareness of the lethal risks. It was a conscious rejection of fear-based paralysis. They accepted that emotional attachment creates severe vulnerability, but pursued it as a deliberate act of defiance. This choice represented a desperate grasp at standard human behavior. Celine initiated affection with Roman, a man entrenched in her initial psychological destruction and subsequent reconstruction. They returned to their residence, suppressing the hypervigilance that plagues trauma survivors. At a certain threshold, the human brain must prioritize basic trust over chronic paranoia to prevent total neurological collapse. They engaged in mundane domesticity, discussing her clinical work treating standard ailments like diabetes. This profound normalcy functioned as a psychological triumph. Suddenly, a message arrived from Luca. Celine interpreted his continued surveillance as loyalty. However, clinically speaking, Luca was exhibiting textbook Stockholm Syndrome, fundamentally unable to detach from the toxic structures that had long dictated his emotional reality. Roman recognized this pathological loyalty, having suffered from identical conditioning. He noted that allegiance to a malignant system inevitably corrupts the psyche. Engaging in tactile grounding techniques, Celine actively segmented her traumatic memories. The severe judicial trials, the invasive monitoring, and the megalomaniacal narcissist who orchestrated their suffering were relegated to secondary cognitive processing. They were executing exposure therapy of their own design, proving that psychological rehabilitation is a rigorous daily regimen. Exchanging verbal affirmations in the dark was not mere sentiment. It was a calculated reinforcement of their shared reality, confirming they had finally begun to rewire their trauma responses, consciously choosing trust over the familiar weight of their past. By morning, the environmental stimuli shifted. Celine awoke to auditory input that contradicted years of conditioned threat responses. Roman was engaged in a mundane domestic ritual, preparing coffee while humming a disjointed melody. For a subject with acute post-traumatic stress, the absolute absence of adrenaline-inducing triggers like hostile federal operatives is profoundly disorienting, yet deeply therapeutic. She observed the banality of the environment, representing a critical milestone in her mental recovery. Donning his discarded clothing, a subconscious protective quirk, she entered the kitchen. His presentation of the beverage, formulated with precise quantities of cream and sugar, demonstrated high cognitive empathy. They stood together, observing the mountains outside, successfully anchoring their highly sensitized nervous systems firmly in the present moment. Their routine shifted toward organized altruism, a defense mechanism against historical guilt. Roman asked about her readiness for a massive community health event, while he projected grand outcomes about saving lives. Celine maintained a clinically realistic perspective, focusing on reducing communal isolation. This healthy moderation sharply contrasted with the megalomaniacal narcissist they once served. Commuting in a second-hand vehicle, they embraced financial scarcity as a psychological cleanser. Upon arrival, the environment was functional chaos with hundreds presenting for care. Celine mobilized her staff, operating not with the hypervigilance of a fugitive, but with the steady focus of a clinician actively repairing her own psyche by tending to the physical needs of others. Let us evaluate Roman's role here. He managed the intake process, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization. He adopted his new identity as a manual laborer, suppressing the neurological pathways associated with his former status as a criminal heir. By midday, a pediatric crisis disrupted the clinic. A juvenile female sought intervention for her siblings' acute respiratory distress. Celine engaged her diagnostic protocols. The young patient exhibited severe bronchial constriction due to an economic inability to procure basic pharmaceuticals. Moving the subject to a controlled examination room, Celine administered a fast-acting bronchodilator. She observed the cessation of respiratory failure with clinical detachment that masked a deep emotional resonance. Dispensing the required medication, she expertly stabilized the immediate physiological crisis. When the mother asked about compensation, Celine applied a strict zero-cost policy, prompting tears of relief. The psychological transference here is a critical behavioral marker. Celine understood this precise desperation. Having survived a criminal system devoid of unconditional support, providing such care allowed her to subconsciously rescue her past self through therapeutic projection. The operation concluded at 8, logging over 300 patient interactions. Their severe physical depletion was counterbalanced by massive neurochemical surges of dopamine. Returning to their secure environment, they bypassed traditional dining rituals due to fatigue. Roman built a fire in the hearth while Celine prepared simple carbohydrates, their domesticity acting as a final behavioral grounding exercise to regulate their highly sensitized nervous systems. Stick with me, this is where the case file gets truly interesting. Roman validated Celine's contributions, contrasting his current constructive labor with his historical pattern of destruction. Staring into the flames, a common focal point for processing cognitive dissonance, he voiced a profound internal conflict. Having spent decades molded by a megalomaniacal narcissist, he questioned if his new life was genuine psychological development or merely sophisticated avoidance behavior. Celine, acting as a stabilizing anchor, closed the physical distance. She reframed his perspective, stating this existence was not historical erasure, but a vital reclamation of autonomy. She clinically pointed out that rejecting a pathological identity is not cowardice, but active boundary setting, reminding him that his former self was suffocating. Celine diagnosed his transformation as a basic survival instinct rather than cowardice. Embracing her, he expressed disbelief at their stability, but she corrected this cognitive distortion. She attributed their survival not to luck, but to their refusal to engage in mutually assured destruction. His laughter indicated a healthy release of psychic tension. They watched the fire decay, then engaged in intimacy that was measured and conscious, reflecting an awareness of their psychological fragility. In the dark, Celine engaged in memory consolidation. She clinically reviewed her trauma trajectory, the secure facility, the transit, the creation of her clinic, and the pressure from their former captors. Analyzing these variables, she realized they had systematically engineered their own psychological cure, proving that true healing is a deliberate, daily behavioral choice. We reach the conclusion of this behavioral case study. Celine thanks Roman for doing the grueling psychological work required to heal. Toxic environments make it easy to remain broken. It requires tremendous cognitive effort to forge a new pathway toward trust. They define their victory not by the absence of danger, but by the presence of meaning. Celine accepts that a secure attachment does not equal absolute safety. It is merely two flawed subjects consciously choosing vulnerability. Despite understanding the probability of pain, 3 years later she accepts a public award, fully integrated into society. The ultimate lesson from their case file is simple. Choosing to love makes you vulnerable to destruction, but choosing to isolate yourself means you are already emotionally dead. They chose to live. Let's open this case file together. The mayor was giving a speech, handing over a community plaque, but Celine was entirely tuned out. Her focus was locked on Roman. From a clinical perspective, his physical baseline had totally transformed. He no longer carried the hypervigilant tension of a syndicate enforcer. Beside him sat Ivy and Marcus, former Boston associates, who had formed a trauma-bonded cohort that stabilized into a healthy family. Celine accepted the award, reciting the expected social scripts about mutual care. But the only data point that mattered happened off the microphone. Roman leaned in, his voice stripped of its old violent defenses, and told her he was proud of what she had built. Celine immediately corrected his cognitive distortion. "We built this," she whispered. "I swing the hammers, but you save the lives." Roman countered immediately. "You saved mine first," he said, referencing the Boston emergency room where he arrived bleeding out, resisting medical help. Celine smiled. The memory felt dissociated, like a clinical profile of two different subjects. "I would not change a single variable," she told him. "Even the extreme stress events that nearly broke us, because they formulated this outcome." Roman studied her face, then kissed her in front of the gathering. When the crowd erupted, they cheered for the clinic. But Celine neurologically processed the sound as validation of their survival. That night, lying in the dark with Roman's hand resting on her stomach, her brain finally stopped running its chronic threats assessments. For the first time in years, she looked at the future without fear. "What is occupying your mind?" Roman asked. Celine detailed her projections, expanding their clinic, and perhaps introducing a new biological variable. A family. Roman's physical reaction was immediate. His nervous system froze. Celine clarified she was proposing a long-term goal. Roman remained nonverbal for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. He confessed he had never modeled a future that was not predicated on systemic violence. A normal family had never been within his parameters. but he wanted to attempt it with her. I want the entire terrifying, chaotic process, Celine told him. They agreed to construct this reality together. They fell asleep holding each other, their brains finally mapping out a new set of psychological coordinates for a future that felt entirely possible. 6 months later, the biological variable was confirmed. Celine sat in the clinic bathroom, her limbic system flooded with dopamine and raw terror. Her mind flashed to Kingpin Vittorio, known to them as Victor Loron. From my clinical standpoint, Vittorio was the ultimate megalomaniac narcissist, a subject whose psychological architecture required the total subjugation of his targets. His threat still haunted her, but Celine actively chose to override her conditioned fear response. That evening, she presented the data to Roman. His reaction was a fascinating break in his lifelong stoicism. He wept. Tears streamed down his face as he held her, repeating his gratitude over and over. "We are actually having a baby," he kept saying. "I am terrified," he admitted, "but I am ecstatic. I am experiencing everything all at once." Roman assessed her state, and Celine confirmed. She accepted this complex array of psychological responses. They disseminated the news to their network. The community absorbed the joy as a collective resource, demonstrating healthy group dynamics. Medically, Celine's gestation was standard, but her internal processing remained volatile. Routine clinic visits triggered flashbacks to their Boston trauma, activating old survival loops. The distant threat of Vittorio still hovered in her peripheral awareness, yet Roman provided constant psychological grounding. He anchored her through every panic attack, steadily reinforcing their secure reality. Then, at the 8-month mark, an unpredictable variable altered the board entirely. The megalomaniac, Victor Loron, suffered a sudden, catastrophic physiological failure. The Kingpin died. It was a sudden myocardial infarction. The data arrived via a message from Luca. "Stick with me here, because Luca is a fascinating case. He suffered from profound Stockholm syndrome, developing a pathological affection for the very organization that kept him caged in violence. Even free, his trauma bond compelled him to monitor them." Luca reported that Celeste had assumed control, exhibiting no interest in old vendettas. Celine and Roman analyzed the variables, deducing that Vittorio was the sole psychological driver of their persecution. His death terminated the threat. 2 weeks after processing this shift in their threat matrix, Celine's labor commenced. Roman drove to the medical center, his autonomic nervous system in overdrive, gripping the wheel in absolute, unregulated terror. Celine observed his acute stress response. "You are supposed to be the regulated one," she noted. Roman insisted he was calm despite profound sweating. The incongruity caused Celine to laugh, releasing tension amid the chaos of childbirth. Their daughter arrived at 3:47 in the morning. Weighing 6 pounds 8 ounces, they named her Hope. Clinically, this was not naive optimism. Hope was the cognitive mechanism that sustained their survival, when giving up was the logical choice. When Roman held the infant, Celine witnessed a true neurological reset. The residual psychological markers of his violent programming dissolved entirely from his face. He looked at his child and made a binding verbal contract, promising to insulate her from the chronic fear of his own youth. Celine observed her family, experiencing a profound stabilization in her nervous system. The residual trauma of Boston still existed in her neural pathways, but it no longer dictated her behavior. Let's advance the timeline 5 years. Celine stood before a massive operational expansion, boasting 4 clinical facilities and 50 personnel. Roman stood beside her, anchoring hope, while their 3-year-old son, James, gripped Celine's hand. James already exhibited his father's behavioral determination. Roman analyzed their growth and directed the credit to his wife. "You constructed this," he observed quietly. "You built a family, and you completely rewired your own psychological trajectory. You became a completely different person than your violent environment tried to force you to be. That is a true anomaly." Roman looked at the children, then shifted focus to Celine. He verbalized a true psychological breakthrough. He was experiencing genuine, uncomplicated happiness. With his history of violent conditioning, achieving this state felt impossible. He believed his past disqualified him from peace. Celine intercepted this cognitive distortion, lacing their fingers together. "Happiness is attainable if you endure the rigorous process of behavioral rehabilitation," she said. "We did the work to earn this baseline." Later they sat on their porch, observing the night sky. "Here is the lesson we must draw from this file. Conscious choice allows anyone to rewrite their own destructive loops. We can always choose to build instead of destroy. The past never has to trap us." "Do you ever think about Boston?" Roman asked into the dark. You and I are going to examine a fascinating pathology today, often seen in trauma bonds. Celine sat sipping her wine, confessing that she missed the adrenaline of the emergency room, that intoxicating life-or-death rush from a clinical perspective. That craving for high stakes made her the perfect psychological match for Roman. Breaking a heavy silence, Roman revealed a letter from the federal prosecutor. The syndicate he once ran was entirely dismantled, his cooperation concluded. The government thanked him for his so-called service to justice. His reaction was clinically telling. He felt utterly hollow. Destroying his father's empire was never about morality. It was a highly calculated maneuver to secure Celine. Justice was merely a convenient byproduct of his obsession. Look closely at how Celine rationalizes his past. When Roman questioned if selfish motives negated a positive outcome, Celine provided the ultimate psychological shield. She argued that dismantling a criminal syndicate was inherently good. Regardless of the catalyst, she equated his ruthless betrayal of his bloodline to the primal instinct of a parent protecting a child. This is classic cognitive reframing, often seen when a subject attempts to justify a deep trauma bond. She smoothed over his violent history by focusing entirely on the positive externalities. Roman, entirely anchored by her acceptance, pulled her close. She had survived the severe psychological fracturing of their past. Channeling that trauma into a thriving medical network, his attachment to her was now absolute. They functioned as two halves of a shared pathology, soothing the fractured parts of their psyches. A decade passed in this carefully constructed isolation. Then came the ultimate test of their adaptation, an invitation for Celine to speak at a medical conference in Boston. Returning to the geographic origin of a severe trauma is a massive psychological trigger. Naturally, her avoidance mechanisms kicked in. She nearly refused the offer entirely, but Roman pushed her toward exposure therapy. He urged her to face the city, to prove that the terrified nurse she used to be was finally gone. She stepped back into the environment that birthed their chaos. Downtown Boston was a sensory assault, the aggressive streets, the biting winter cold. It was a terrifying baseline to revisit. Stick with me here, because her behavior in Boston perfectly illustrates the lingering power of environmental conditioning. After a successful presentation, Celine experienced a dissociative pull, driven by pure muscle memory. She walked back to the very hospital where her life had shattered. Standing across the street, she observed the frantic flow of medical staff, clinically comparing her past self to her current reality. The Celine of the past was trapped in a pure survival state, a nervous system locked in constant fight or flight. Today, she had sublimated that trauma into an empire of care. Breaking the hypnotic hold of the building, she turned to leave and physically collided with a ghost from her previous life, Dr. Reeves, an undeniable anchor to her violent past. In that brief conversation, Celine was forced to verbally process her escape. When Dr. Reeves noted her abrupt vanishing, her mind flashed back to the inciting incident, Roman bleeding on her examination table. From an analytical standpoint, she no longer viewed that night with terror. She categorized it as the necessary catalyst for her current stability. She simply stated she had needed to leave, rejecting his offered return. By walking away from that hospital, she severed the final psychological tether to her trauma. Returning to Colorado, she was instantly grounded by her new reality. Roman and their 2 children were waiting at the airport. When asked about Boston, her response indicated profound cognitive healing. Her internal perception of the past had radically shifted. Let us analyze this crucial emotional baseline. Celine confessed that the frightened woman she used to be felt like a stranger, a healthy dissociation from her former victimhood. When Roman asked if she had visited the hospital, her response was the ultimate indicator of psychological recovery. She felt nothing. No crippling anxiety, no nostalgia, just a flat acknowledgement of a sterile past. This is what clinical closure looks like in practice later. Swaying together in the quiet safety of their kitchen, they acknowledged the sheer, statistical improbability of their survival. They had completely overwritten their destructive behavioral loops. As Roman whispered that they would keep building this life every day, it was clear his predatory drive had been fully rechanneled. We can close the file on Roman and Celine with a profound behavioral observation. Outside, the vast Colorado landscape stretched into the dark. Inside, these 2 deeply scarred individuals continued making a conscious, daily decision to override their autonomic fear responses with deliberate acts of trust. Survival, at its psychological core, is never a singular event. It is an ongoing series of micro-choices to endure, despite the heavy weight of past trauma. Celine transformed from a hostage of circumstance into the architect of her own reality. And here is the simple, meaningful life lesson we can extract from their turbulent case file. The most resilient thing the human mind can do is not just surviving the darkness. It is actively choosing to build a life worth fighting for.
One of the strongest lessons in Celine and Roman's story is that love alone is not enough if it does not come with courage. Roman loves Celine, but when he is forced to choose between her and his family's criminal empire, he chooses fear. He marries Celeste, believing he is protecting Celine from his father's threats. But protection built on lies still becomes betrayal. This teaches an important emotional lesson. Love cannot be separated from honesty. Roman may have believed he was saving Celine, but he took away her right to choose. Instead of trusting her with the truth, he decided for her. That is not real partnership. Real love does not hide behind sacrifice while leaving the other person broken and confused. Celine's pain is powerful because she was willing to choose Roman. She was ready to leave everything behind. But Roman did not give her the same respect. He loved her, but he was not brave enough to fight with her. That is why his love failed the first time. The educational message here is clear. If we love someone, we must be brave enough to be honest with them, even when the truth is dangerous or painful. A relationship cannot survive if one person makes all the decisions and calls it protection. Later, Roman finally understands this. He stops hiding behind duty and begins taking responsibility for his choices. His transformation shows that courage is not just facing enemies. Sometimes courage is admitting you were wrong, telling the truth, and allowing the person you hurt to decide whether you deserve another chance. Love becomes meaningful only when it is strong enough to choose truth over fear.